Emergency alert. The cemetery is alive. The don't step inside the gates after midnight. The soil moves like it's breathing. And if you hear it call your name, don't answer.
The fog rolled in thick and relentless, swallowing the island whole each evening like a living shroud. It wasn't just mist, it was a presence, a blanket that softened sounds and blurred outlines until the world beyond the cemetery gates seemed to vanish entirely. I stood at the entrance, the wrought iron gate cold and rusted in my grip. The groan it gave as I pulled it open echoing like a warning in the muted night. My name is Ilias Crane, and I am the gravedigger here, the man who tends to the dead on this fog-covered island. The cemetery sprawled before me, a twisted maze of leaning tombstones and unkempt earth, all swallowed by the creeping fog. The ground beneath my boots was spongy with dew and decay, and sometimes, just sometimes, I could swear it breathed, as though the earth itself inhaled and exhaled beneath the mouldering graves. It was late, the hour when the island slipped into its deepest quiet, and the whispers began. They were faint at first, like a breath caught in the wind, barely there, but impossible to ignore. A soft susurration rose from the soil, a murmur that threaded through the fog and wrapped around my senses. And then, unmistakably, I heard it, my name, carried on the cold air, whispered with a voice that was both intimate and alien. As I stiffened, heart hammering against ribs that felt too thin and fragile. The whisper was not a trick of the wind, nor was it the groan of the old trees. It was something else, something alive, something that wanted me. My hands trembled as I looked down at the earth, dark and wet, seeming to pulse faintly beneath the surface. The island had always been a place of solitude, a sanctuary for those who preferred silence and distance. But lately, that solitude had become a cage. I'd left once before, escaping the weight of my past, a mistake that cost my sister Lily her life. But I returned, drawn back by a need to atone, to bury not just bodies but my guilt. The fog thickened, swallowing the edges of the graveyard like a living thing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, threading through the air and settling into my bones. They were the voices of the dead, restless and bound to this place, but also something darker, something older. The ground was not just soil and stone, it was memory, sorrow, and something that breathed beneath. I lit my lantern, its flickering flame a fragile beacon in the encroaching dark, and began my rounds. Each grave I passed seemed to lean closer, the shadows stretching like fingers eager to touch. The whispers followed me, calling my name, weaving through the fog in a twisted lullaby. My mind drifted to Lily. Her face haunted my dreams, soft features blurred by tears, her laughter a ghost I could never quite catch. I blamed myself for her death, the accident that shattered everything. I had left the island hoping to outrun that guilt, but here it clung to me like the fog, unshakable and cold. The cemetery was more than a resting place. It was a living thing, breathing and whispering, pulling me closer with every step. The whispers promised secrets and perhaps a reckoning. I was trapped between the living and the dead, between memory and madness, standing on the edge of something I could not yet name. And as the night deepened, the fog thickened, and the whispers grew louder, calling me into the darkness. As I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the chill that seeped deeper than the cold air. This was only the beginning. The graveyard was alive, and it had marked me. I tightened my grip on the shovel in my hands and stepped forward, into the breathing earth and the whispering night. The cold seeped into my bones as I stood among the weathered stones, the fog thick and suffocating around the edges of the cemetery. The night was alive with a soft, almost imperceptible sound, whispers that seemed to drift up from the very earth beneath my feet. At first, they were faint, like the distant rustle of leaves or the sigh of wind weaving through the cracked gravestones. But as the minutes passed, the murmurs grew louder, folding into themselves until I could swear I heard my own name spoken clearly within them. Elias, Elias. The voice was a cruel echo, a siren's call that pried open the locked chambers of my mind. I gripped the shovel handle tighter, knuckles whitening, as a cold sweat trickled down my spine. It was the same voice I hadn't dared to hear for years, the voice of my failure, my regret, my loss. My sister Lily. Her laughter once filled this island with light, a warmth that even the harshest winters couldn't extinguish. But all that was gone now, taken in an instant that I still replayed endlessly in the dark corners of my mind. The accident, the moment I could have saved her, but didn't. Or rather, the moment I convinced myself I couldn't. The whispers didn't just murmur my name. They dredged up the fragments of that terrible night, weaving shadows around my memories. I saw her face again, clear and vivid, framed by the dying sun, bright eyes sparkling with innocence, a smile that once made the world seem whole. And then the crash, the sudden silence, the crushing weight of being left behind. I staggered back toward an ancient oak, the bark rough against my trembling hands. The fog curled around me like a living thing, pressing in, soft and suffocating. "Why do you call me?" I whispered into the mist, but the only answer was the echo of my own voice and the relentless whispering beneath the soil. Each night the voices grew bolder, more insistent. It wasn't just the wind or the shifting earth anymore. It was something deliberate, something alive. I began to notice patterns, faint syllables carried on the breeze, whispered secrets that made my skin crawl. The ground beneath me seemed to breathe, exhaling cold words that tugged at the edges of my sanity. Sleep became a stranger. Dreams were haunted by Lily's face, her voice calling me through shadowed corridors of memory and fear. I awoke with the taste of regret thick on my tongue, the whispers bleeding into the dawn, relentless and unforgiving. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the fog thickened to a suffocating blanket, I found myself drawn to a freshly turned grave near the old chapel. The earth pulsed beneath my boots, and I heard it unmistakable, urgent, "Elias, come back." I knelt, fingers brushing the damp soil, heart pounding like a drum in the stillness. The voice was no longer distant. It was close, intimate, a breath on the back of my neck. And with it came the flood of memories I had buried deep: the car, the screech of tires, the shattered glass, Lily's small hand slipping from mine into the void. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let the darkness claim me. "No," I said aloud, voice raw, "I'm still here. I'm not coming with you." But the whispers didn't relent. They promised release, peace, and an end to the pain. They offered a doorway I was afraid to cross but felt inexorably pulled toward. Back in the cramped confines of my cabin, the only light a faint glow from a battered oil lamp, I sat at the rough wooden table. My hands trembled as I pulled out a sheet of paper, a letter to Lily, to the ghost of my sister who haunted both my waking hours and my dreams. "I'm sorry," I wrote, the words barely legible through the tears. "I never meant to leave you behind. I carry you with me every day. Please forgive me." Outside, the whispers drifted through the cracks in the walls, a chorus of sorrow and longing that refused to be silenced. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The echoes of my guilt were alive, breathing beneath the fog, waiting, watching, calling me home. As the candle flickered low, I felt the weight of the island's silence pressing in. The whispers were no longer just echoes of the past. They were a summons, a reminder that some debts could never be paid in full. And the graveyard was patient, its breath steady and cold, ready to claim what it was owed. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for what was to come. And in the distance, through the thickening fog, I heard it again, my name, carried on the breath of the earth itself. Elias. The night held its breath, and I was listening. The door creaked as I pushed it open, stepping into a room that smelled of old paper and damp wood. Maravos's study was a chaotic sanctuary of island history books stacked haphazardly, yellowed maps pinned to the walls, and trinkets that looked as though they'd been pulled from the very soil outside. The low light filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows that flickered with the sway of the ancient oaks outside. Mara looked up from the table, where she was arranging a spread of documents, her sharp eyes meeting mine with a seriousness that immediately set the tone. "Elias," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "you re-chasing shadows, but there's more to this island than just whispers in the fog. The dead don't rest here, not properly." I nodded, taking a seat opposite her. The weight of the cemetery's strange murmurs had been pressing me down, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I needed answers, and Mara was the only one who might have them. She slid a weathered map toward me, its edges frayed and stained. "This is the oldest chart we have of the island," she explained, tapping a finger on the sprawling cemetery at its center. "See these marks? They were places where people have reported strange happenings, voices, shadows, things moving when no one's there." I traced the lines with a finger, feeling the rough texture of the paper beneath my skin. "You think the ground itself is alive?" Mara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not alive like us, but aware. The island holds its memories in the soil. The dead here aren't silent, they're restless." Her words stirred something deep inside me. The whispering it heard, faint but persistent, calling my name from beneath the earth, it wasn't just the wind or my imagination. It was something else, something old and terrible. She pulled an ancient leather-bound book toward me, opening it to pages filled with faded script and crude illustrations. "Our ancestors believed the island was cursed," she said, "that the spirits of those lost to tragedy and violence refused to move on. Over time, their sorrow and rage fused into something dark, something that feeds on guilt and fear." The idea sent a chill down my spine. I thought of Lily, her face, her laughter, the accident that stole her from me. Could my guilt be feeding this darkness? Was the whispering shade, as Mara called it, more than just a tale? "There's more," Mara continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some say the soil itself breathes. That if you listen closely, the earth exhales the voices of the dead, whispers that can lure the living into their embrace." I swallowed hard, the room suddenly feeling colder. The stories I'd heard from old Tom, the strange sensations beneath my feet, they all connected. I wasn't just digging graves. I was digging into a secret that might consume me. "What can I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Mara hesitated before answering. "Knowledge is the first step, understanding the history, the rituals, the reasons behind the unrest. But be careful, Elias. The more you dig, the deeper you sink." Her warning hung heavy between us as the wind outside picked up, rattling the window panes. I stood, clutching the ancient book to my chest. The fog was thickening, and with it came the faintest murmur, a whisper from the soil that sounded unmistakably like my name. I stepped outside into the encroaching dusk, the island's secrets pressing in around me. The ground beneath my boots felt alive, pulsing with a rhythm I could neither ignore nor understand. Somewhere in the shifting mist, the whispering shade stirred, waiting, watching. And I was no longer sure if I'd find answers or if I was already part of the island's dark story. The whispers were growing louder. The evening had settled over the island like a thick, suffocating blanket, the fog curling around everything with the slow persistence of a living thing. I found my way to old Tom's cabin, a squat, weather-beaten structure perched on the edge of the village, its timbers groaning under the weight of years and secrets. The faint glow of a lantern spilled from the window, casting long, trembling shadows across the rocky path. I hesitated a moment, the cold pressing in my bones as the whispers, soft, distant, almost coaxing, slithered through the mist. Gathering what little courage I had left, I knocked. The door creaked open, revealing old Tom's gaunt face, lined deep with wrinkles and shadowed by a cap pulled low against the chill. His eyes, sharp and wary, flicked over me before he stepped aside wordlessly, the scent of tobacco and damp earth greeting me as I entered. Inside, the cabin was cramped and cluttered, shelves sagging under the weight of dusty books and odd trinkets, remnants of a long life, lived close to the land and its stories. A low fire smoldered in the hearth, casting flickering light that danced across old Tom's weathered features. "You shouldn't be out here after dark," he muttered, his voice rough like gravel. "Especially not with the fog thickening." I swallowed hard, the weight of my purpose pressing me forward. I need to know Tom, about the whispers, about the curse this island carries. He stared at me, eyes narrowing, the lines of his face deepening. "You rechasing shadows, Elias. But some shadows are more than just tricks of the light." I took a seat on the worn stool opposite him, the wood creaking beneath my weight. "I hear them every night, calling my name. The ground beneath the graves it breathes. I can feel it." Old Tom's gaze dropped to the floor, then back up, steady and unflinching. "That's no ordinary haunting. The island's got a long memory, longer than any of us. There's a curse settled on this place, born from grief and violence, fed by the restless dead who can't find peace." His words hung heavy between us, the flickering firelight throwing his shadow against the walls like a spectre. "The whispers you hear, they are not just voices. They recalls from something ancient, something hungry. It feeds on guilt and fear, dragging souls down to the earth, binding them here, where death refuses to rest." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the cabin seeming to close in around me. "How do you know this?" Old Tom shrugged, a gesture heavy with years of sorrow. "I've lived long enough to see friends and family swallowed by those whispers, to hear their names called from the graves, and to watch them walk willingly into the night, never to return." The room fell silent save for the crackling fire and the distant, haunting moan of the wind beyond the cabin walls. Suddenly, a sharp gust rattled the window panes, and the fog pressed closer, as if eager to listen to our conversation. "You have to be careful, Elias," Old Tom warned, voice dropping to a whisper. "Once the whispers find their mark, they don't let go." I nodded slowly, the dread settling deep in my chest. "I can't ignore it. Not anymore." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, worn charm, a simple carved piece of driftwood tied with frayed twine. "Keep this close. It won't save you, but it might give you a moment's grace." I accepted the charm, feeling its rough edges press into my palm, a fragile talisman against the growing darkness. As I stepped back into the fog-choked night, the whispers seemed to swell, curling around me like ghostly fingers. Old Tom's warning echoed in my mind, mingling with the voices from the earth, urging me onward into a mystery darker and deeper than I had imagined. The fog wrapped the island in a suffocating embrace as I made my way through the cemetery, a place where the dead no longer rested easy. The night air was dense, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decayed leaves, and the faint murmur of whispers seemed to rise from the soil itself. I paused beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient oak, its skeletal limbs clawing at the sky like twisted fingers. The whispers grew clearer, more insistent, and then I saw her, Lily. She appeared like a fading candle flame, a pale silhouette shimmering through the thick fog. Her eyes, soft and sorrowful, locked onto mine, and for a moment the world fell away. I could hear her name whispered on the wind, a fragile thread of sound that tugged at the edges of my sanity. "Elias," she breathed, voice barely more than a sigh. The sight of her was both a balm and a blade, stirring memories I had tried so hard to bury. I staggered back, my heart pounding wildly as the apparition flickered and wavered, dissolving into the mist as quickly as she had appeared. But the ache she left behind was real, raw and gnawing. I retreated to my cabin, the cramped space smelling faintly of earth and old wood. Flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, while I sifted through a collection of photographs and letters tangled with dust and time. Lily's laughter echoed faintly in my ears, a haunting melody that blurred the line between memory and madness. I traced my fingers over a worn photograph of us as children, her bright smile frozen in time. That smile was the last thing I'd seen before the accident, the moment everything changed. The guilt that had weighed on me since then pressed down like a stone in my chest, unbearable and unrelenting. The whispers weren't just sounds anymore. They were voices from my past, stirring the embers of regret into a roaring fire. Later, under the shroud of midnight, I found myself wandering back into the fog-blanketed cemetery. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse, breathing in time with the whispers that now called not only my name but hers as well. Among the gravestones, her figure appeared intermittently, beckoning me closer with a silent plea. I wanted to reach out to touch the ghostly presence, but an icy chill held me back, a warning or a trap, I couldn't tell which. The weight of the past pressed down harder than ever as I sank to my knees beside the oldest grave, clutching the locket she had once worn close to her heart. The air thickened, heavy with unshed tears and unspoken truths. The whispering soil beneath me pulsed like a heartbeat, and Lily's apparition leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper but full of unbearable sorrow. "Face it, Elias," she urged. "Face what you've hidden." Her words cut through the haze of denial I'd wrapped myself in for so long. The visions were no longer just haunting memories. They were a summons, a challenge from the restless dead, and the malevolent force that fed on my guilt. As the fog closed in around me, I realized the path ahead would force me to confront not just the island's dark secrets, but the deepest, most painful parts of myself, and there was no turning back. The night did not end with relief or peace. Instead, it left me trembling on the edge of something vast and terrible, the whispers a constant reminder that death here was restless and demandingly close. I was caught between worlds, between the living and the dead, past and present, guilt and redemption. And in that liminal space, the shadow of Lily's memory loomed large, a beacon and a curse. With dawn still hours away, I knew I had to prepare to face the darkness both outside and within. The whispers had grown louder, their call more personal, and the visions of Lily were no longer simply memories but warnings. Somewhere beneath the breathing earth, the whispering shade waited, patient and hungry, ready to claim what it was owed. And I was the debt it sought to collect. I rose slowly, the locket cold in my palm, and stepped back into the fog. The island was silent now, but the silence was thick with promise and dread. Tomorrow I would seek Mara's counsel again. Tomorrow I would delve deeper into the island's cursed history and my own fractured soul. Tonight, all I could do was listen to the whispers and remember the girl I had lost. The graveyard breathed around me, alive with sorrow and secrets, and I was trapped in its relentless embrace. The line between memory and nightmare blurred, and the weight of my guilt pressed down like the soil beneath my feet, unyielding, eternal, and impossible to escape. But I would try, I had to, for Lily's sake, and for my own. The whispers would not let me rest. The night wrapped the island in its usual cloak of thick fog, a suffocating blanket that blurred the edges of the world and swallowed the distant cries of the sea. I had always known the cemetery to be a place apart, but tonight, as I stepped through the rusted iron gate, a sudden shift in the air made my skin prickle with unease. The ground beneath my boots seemed to breathe, a slow rhythmic pulse that echoed through the soles of my worn leather shoes. I paused, bending down to place my calloused hands on the cold earth. At first, it was subtle, a faint rising and falling, like the chest of a sleeping giant. Then it grew stronger, the soil swelling and receding beneath my fingers, as if inhaling the night itself. Whispers, barely audible at first, swirled through the mist, curling around my ears with urgent insistence. They spoke my name soft and sorrowful, tugging at the raw edges of my memory. Elias, Elias. The voice was both a beckon and a warning. I straightened, heart hammering, eyes scanning the shadowed rows of headstones that stretched into the darkness. The fog thickened, curling like smoke around gnarled branches and ancient mausoleums. Somewhere just beyond sight, a presence stirred, one I could feel more than see, a malevolence that pressed against my skin like the cold breath of the grave. I swallowed hard, the taste of damp earth filling my mouth. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices rising and falling like a dark tide. I could make out fragments of speech, desperate pleas and mournful cries blending with the rustle of dead leaves and the faint drip of moisture from the ancient oaks. Kneeling beside one of the freshly dug graves, I rested my palm against the soil. The pulse beneath my hand was unmistakable, now steady, alive, and frighteningly intimate. It felt as though the earth itself was breathing, a living thing bound to the sorrow and death buried beneath. The sensation sent a shiver racing up my spine, a mingling of terror and fascination that rooted me to the spot. From the depths of the mist, glowing eyes flickered faintly pale embers that danced just beyond the reach of the moonlight. They watched me, unblinking and patient, carrying the weight of centuries of sorrow and rage. The whispering shade had made its presence known. I tried to steady my breath, to push back the rising panic clawing at my mind. But the whispers were relentless, threading through my thoughts like poison vines. They dredged up memories I had tried to bury: the laughter of Lily, the accident, the unbearable silence that followed. The earth seemed to pulse with her sorrow, the weight of my guilt pressing down like the heavy fog. "Come," the voices urged. I wanted to run, to flee the island and the nightmare it had become. But some dark thread tied me here, an invisible chain forged from grief and regret. The breathing earth beneath me was a reminder restless death was not at peace, and neither was I. As the whispers grew into a chorus, I realized the ground was not merely alive. It was a conduit, a gateway for the whispering shade to reach into the world of the living. And it was calling me home. I forced myself to rise, wiping the cold mud from my hands. The night around me felt charged, electric with menace. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, and the glowing eyes blinked out of sight. But the dread lingered, a heavy cloak I could not shed. I took a step toward the heart of the cemetery, toward the source of the breathing earth, and the voices that haunted my every waking moment. The island was alive with secrets, and the whispering shade was waiting for me to unravel them. Tonight, the graveyard breathed, and I was its unwilling witness. But what would happen when it exhaled? The whispering soil beneath my feet seemed to pulse in time with my own ragged heartbeat, and I knew the night was far from over. The cramped room smelled of damp earth and old paper, a scent that seemed to mingle with the salt-laden breeze sneaking in through the cracked window. Maravos sat cross-legged on the creaking wooden floor, a leather-bound diary resting on her knees. Her fingers trembled slightly as she brushed centuries of dust from its cover, the brittle pages beneath whispering of long-forgotten sorrows. I watched her in silence, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed almost to reach out, eager to consume the secrets held within. "This belonged to one of the earliest settlers," Mara explained quietly, her voice threaded with reverence and unease. "A man named Jonas Harker. He was a gravedigger here long before me, long before you." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The island's past had always been a shadowy presence at the edge of my thoughts, but now, with Mara holding this relic, it felt dangerously close, almost alive. She opened the diary carefully, revealing pages yellowed with time and scrawled with frantic, cramped handwriting. The first entry was dated nearly 2 centuries ago, and as Mara read aloud, her voice dropped into a whisper. "The earth breathes beneath us, restless as the souls it holds. The dead whisper in the fog, calling names we dare not answer. Those who listen too closely find their lives unraveling, drawn into the shade that feeds on sorrow." A shiver ran down my spine. The words echoed the whispers I'd heard in the dead of night, the voices that clawed at the edges of my mind. But here, in this fragile book, they were more than mere hallucinations or superstition. They were a chilling testament to the island's cursed legacy. Mara turned the pages, revealing more entries that painted a grim picture of the island's history. Tales of settlers lost to madness, families torn apart by grief, and an ever-present darkness that seemed to seep from the very soil. The diary spoke of a shadowy entity, a malevolent force that fed on the guilt and fear of those who lived here, binding them to the graveyard's eternal torment. "The whispering shade," Mara murmured, closing the diary gently. "It's not just a legend, it's real. It's been here all along, feeding on the pain, growing stronger with every soul it traps. I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over me like a suffocating fog. The whispers weren't just noises in the night. They were the breath of something ancient and hungry, something that had marked me long before I even returned to this island. We sat in silence, the only sound the occasional crackle of the candle flame. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. Then, a sudden gust rattled the panes, snuffing out the light and plunging us into darkness. In that instant, the whispers rose, louder and more insistent, as if awakened by the diary's revelation. "We have to be careful," Mara said, her voice barely more than a breath. "Knowledge is a double-edged sword here. But we need to understand it if we were going to stand a chance." I nodded, though my heart pounded with a mix of dread and determination. The path ahead was darker than ever, but now I knew what I was facing. The whispering shade was no mere ghost, it was a force born of centuries of pain, bound to this place and to me. As the night deepened and the fog thickened outside, I clutched the diary, a fragile link to the past and a beacon that might just lead me through the suffocating shadows. Whatever awaited, I was no longer walking blind into the graveyard's breath. I was ready to confront the whispers and the truth they carried. But as the candle's glow vanished and the whispers grew, a question gnawed at the edges of my mind. Could I survive the shadows I was about to face, or was I already too far gone? The diary had opened a door, and there was no turning back now. The night had settled over the island like a thick, suffocating shroud, the fog curling and coiling among the gravestones like living tendrils. I stood at the edge of the cemetery, the cold dampness seeping through the soles of my boots, and listened. The world was unnervingly silent, save for the occasional rustle of dead leaves skittering across the cracked stone markers and the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore. My breath came out in shallow puffs, the rhythm broken by an unease that had taken root deep inside me. For weeks now, the whispers had been growing stronger, soft, indecipherable murmurs that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath my feet. But this night was different. As I stood alone, the fog wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, and then I heard it, clear as a bell, cutting through the silence with haunting precision, "Elias." I froze, my name spoken from beneath the soil itself, echoed faintly but unmistakably. The hairs on the back of my neck stood erect, and my heart hammered against my ribs like a desperate prisoner. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the wind or my own fractured mind playing cruel games. But no, the voice was real. It was calling me. The cemetery stretched out before me, a graveyard suspended in time and shadow, the headstones mottled with moss and age, their inscriptions worn to illegibility. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse subtly, as if breathing, inhaling the cold night air and exhaling secrets long buried. I took a hesitant step forward, the damp earth sinking slightly underfoot. Another whisper rose, this time more urgent, whispering my name again, "Elias, Elias." I reached down instinctively, pressing my ear against the soil, the chill seeping through my gloves. The voice was there, soft, desperate, impossibly close. It was like the earth itself was alive, speaking directly to me. I struggled to steady my breath, to hold on to reason in the face of something that defied all logic. A sudden shiver ran through me as a cold breath brushed my neck. I spun around, eyes straining through the fog, but there was nothing. Only shadows that seemed to flicker and dance at the edges of my vision, shadows that didn't quite belong. The glowing eyes appeared faint, malevolent pinpricks of light that slipped and shifted like smoke among the tombstones. The whispering shade was watching, waiting, and it had found me. Fear gnawed at my mind, but so did a strange, twisted fascination. What did it want? Why was it calling me? I had always known the island held secrets, dark and deep, but this was something else. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse with a rhythm all its own, a heartbeat of earth and sorrow, pulling me closer. The whispers grew louder, an unbearable chorus of voices rising from the graveyard's depths, each one calling my name, begging, pleading, threatening. My hands trembled as I stepped back, struggling to break free from the magnetic pull of the voices. The cold fog wrapped tighter, pressing against my skin, and I felt as though the earth were breathing against my face. The line between the living and the dead blurred, and I realized I was caught in the eye of a storm that had been brewing for centuries. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, the soil gripping me like a lover's embrace too fierce to escape. Then, a single thought pierced through the fog of fear. If I did not face this, if I did not answer the call, I would be lost forever. The whispers were no longer just echoes. They were a summons, and I was the one they wanted. Elias, the voice breathed again, softer this time, almost tender. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes upon me. Somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance ignited. I would not be taken without a fight. But the question remained, what awaited me beyond the veil of whispers and shadows? And could I survive the truth that the island and its restless dead had in store? The night stretched on, endless and oppressive, as I stood alone in the cemetery, the soil beneath me alive with secrets. The first call had come, and the game had begun. The air in Mara's study was thick with dust and the scent of aged paper, a tangible weight that pressed down on me as I stepped inside. Books teetered in unsteady piles, their cracked spines whispering secrets of a past long buried in the island's soil. Mara stood by a battered wooden table, her sharp eyes flickering with a mixture of urgency and exhaustion. She motioned me closer, her voice dropping to a hushed tone as if the very walls might listen. Elias, she began, these restless souls you feel, they were not just echoes from the past. They're retethered here, bound by grief, by violence, by the unresolved pain of lives cut short. Their suffering feeds the shade. It grows stronger with every heartbeat of sorrow. I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over me like the fog that clung to the island each night. The whispers I'd been hearing weren't random murmurs. They were cries from the trapped dead. Their anguish was a current pulling me further into the darkness. Outside, the cemetery lay shrouded in thick mist, the silhouettes of crooked headstones emerging like specters in the gloom. I found myself drawn to a freshly dug grave, the earth still loose and trembling beneath my feet. A faint, sorrowful cry brushed against my ears, barely audible but unmistakably human. My skin prickled as if invisible fingers traced down my spine, cold and insistent. They're restless, I confessed, my voice barely more than a whisper, and their pain it's alive. Mara nodded solemnly, stepping beside me. This island holds more than just memories. It holds their souls captive. The shade feeds on them, on your guilt, on all the pain bound here. It's an ancient force born from centuries of tragedy. A sudden gust swept through the cemetery, rattling the leaves and carrying with it a chorus of faint voices. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision, shapes that melted into the fog like ink dissolving in water. Then briefly, two faintly glowing eyes pierced the mist, the unmistakable signature of the whispering shade. I blinked, heart hammering, and when I looked again, the eyes were gone, swallowed by the night. Back in Mara's study, the atmosphere was charged with a tense energy. Papers fluttered as the wind slipped through a cracked window, scattering her notes like restless spirits desperate to be heard. I clenched my fists, the weight of the island's torment settling deep in my bones. We were running out of time, Mara said quietly. The shade's hunger is growing. If we don't find a way to sever these ties, it will consume more than just souls. It will consume you. Her words echoed in my mind as the whispers swelled once more, now a haunting lullaby that called my name. I was tethered to this place, to these souls, to this curse. There was no turning back, but as the night deepened, so did my resolve. I would face whatever darkness lurked beneath the earth. I would confront my guilt, the island's history, and the whispering shade itself. For if these restless souls could not find peace, neither could I. The shadows pressed closer, the whispers louder, and the island waited for me, for the truth, for the reckoning that was yet to come. The fog lay thick and suffocating over the island that night, winding its cold tendrils through the ancient cemetery like a living thing. I sat on the cold stone of a weathered grave marker, my breath visible in the chill air, watching as the mist curled and danced in the faint moonlight. The whispers had grown louder again, more pressing, swirling around me like a chorus of desperate voices. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were fingers clawing at the edges of my sanity. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse, a slow, steady rhythm that matched the pounding in my skull. I could feel the weight of the isolation pressing down, heavier than the fog itself, as if the island was conspiring to squeeze the life from me. Days had blurred into nights without distinction. The echoes of my footsteps were the only company I allowed myself, but even then, the whispers slithered just beneath the surface of sound. They called my name, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, as if the earth itself remembered me and refused to let go. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, the settling of old soil, but the way those murmurs wove through the fog told a different story. Inside my cabin, the walls seemed to close in. The flickering candlelight cast long, twitching shadows that mocked my every movement. I sat motionless, staring at the wavering flame, willing it to burn steady and bright, but the darkness always crept back in. The whispers followed me here, too quiet now, but no less persistent. They filled the silence between heartbeats, a constant reminder of what I couldn't escape. One night, as the fog thickened to a nearly impenetrable whiteness, I heard it again, a soft, tentative footstep behind me. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but there was nothing, just the empty stretch of the cemetery, gravestones poking through the mist like jagged teeth. My own breathing felt loud, intrusive. The silence that followed was almost worse, stretching out, thick and expectant. I knew the island was watching, waiting, and I was alone. Mara came that afternoon, her sharp eyes cutting through the grey as she stepped onto the rutted path leading to my cabin. Her presence was like a sudden gust of wind, stirring the stale air and bringing a flicker of warmth to the cold place I'd made my refuge. She didn't ask how I was. We both knew the answer. Instead, she brought news and a quiet determination that I envied. Her steady voice was a tether, pulling me back from the edge of the abyss, even if only for a moment. "You can't let it consume you, Elias," she said, her gaze unwavering. "This island has a way of twisting minds, but you re stronger than it." I wanted to believe her. I clung to that hope like a drowning man to driftwood. But the whispers had other plans. They curled around my thoughts, drowning out reason, filling me with shadows and doubt. I found myself speaking aloud in the dark, as if the dead might answer, as if their voices could ease the ache inside. "Why won't you leave me be?" I whispered one night, voice raw and cracked. "What do you want from me?" No answer came, only the soft rustling of leaves and the distant call of a night bird. Yet the ground beneath the cabin shifted imperceptibly, as if listening. Days blurred. I became a ghost in my own life, drifting through the cemetery with hollow eyes and shaking hands. The people on the island kept their distance now, whispers of my unraveling spreading like wildfire. Mara was the only constant, the only one who refused to abandon me. She brought books, old rituals, stories of the settlers who had first cursed this land with their violence and sorrow. But knowledge was a fragile shield against the creeping madness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds, I sat near the oldest part of the cemetery. The whispers rose in a crescendo, voices overlapping in a cacophony of grief and accusation. I pressed my hands to the cold earth, willing myself to listen not with fear, but with understanding. The ground trembled beneath me, and for a moment, I felt connected to the dead, to the island, to the terrible force that fed on our guilt. Mara's voice broke through the storm of sound. "You are not alone, Elias. You have to fight this." But the fight was wearing thin. The isolation was a cage tightening around my ribs, the whispers a chorus that would never cease. I realized then that the real battle was not with the shade or the dead, but with the parts of myself I wanted to bury forever. And as the fog swallowed the last light of day, I knew the whispers were waiting for me to give in. Waiting for me to become one with the graveyard that breathed in the dead of night. The island held its breath, and so did I. The fog had thickened by the time I made my way back to the farthest edge of the cemetery, where the oldest graves leaned crooked against time and decay. The damp, salty air clung to my skin, and each breath tasted faintly of earth and rot. Moonlight struggled to penetrate the mist, casting ghostly silver hues that flickered over the tombstones like restless spirits themselves. My boots sank slightly into the soggy ground, a muted squelch echoing softly in the stillness. I paused, staring out into the swirling grey void, the whispers having faded to a low murmur that hummed beneath the sound of the night. My name felt like a fragile thread woven through the dark fabric of the island's breath, fragile yet persistent. Then, from the corner of my eye, movement stirred. A shadow shifted, not cast by the moon or any earthly thing, but something fluid and unnatural, melting into the fog like smoke caught in a slow wind. I blinked hard, heart hammering, convinced it was a trick of the mist or my mind playing cruel games. But the shadows did not retreat. Instead, they gathered, curling and unfurling like dark tendrils with no clear form. Within the swirling darkness, twin points of faintly glowing eyes emerged, cold, unblinking, and filled with a depth of ancient malice that sent a shiver racing down my spine. The whispering shade had revealed itself, not as a mere ghostly apparition, but as an entity alive with hunger and spite. It was no longer a whisper, no longer just a voice in the soil, it was a presence that watched and waited, its gaze weighing down on me like the weight of the island's collective sorrow. I tried to steady my breath, feeling the cold bite of fear coil in my gut. My hands clenched into fists, nails biting into the palms, grounding me against the rising tide of panic. The air grew colder still, and the whispers swelled into a chorus of fragmented voices, rising and falling like the tide, threading through the fog with a chilling clarity. They spoke not only my name, but the names of those long dead, their anguish palpable, pressing in from all sides. A sudden gust tore through the cemetery, stirring dry leaves and rattling loose branches. The mist twisted into writhing shapes, as if the very air was alive with the shade's hunger. I took a step back, but the glowing eyes tracked me relentlessly, unyielding and eternal. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse faintly, breathing in rhythm with the whispers, as if the earth itself was a living thing. The realization hit me with a crushing weight. The shade fed on guilt, on sorrow, on the unresolved pain that lingered in the bones of the island and its people. It was a predator that thrived on the living's torment, dragging them ever closer to the grave with each whispered call. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move, turning away from the shadows and retreating toward the old chapel that stood near the cemetery's heart. Its stone walls were cracked and worn, windows shattered by time and storm, but it was the only shelter I could think of. As I crossed the worn path, the glowing eyes followed from the mist, flickering in and out like dying embers. Inside, the chapel was cold and silent, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I found a broken pew to sit on, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my racing heart. Outside, the whispers continued, a relentless susurrus that seeped through the crumbling walls, promising that the shade would not rest until it had claimed me. I closed my eyes, trying to summon strength from the memories of Mara's words, the knowledge of the island's cursed history, and the fragile hope that somewhere in the darkness, a way to break the cycle still existed. But in that moment, surrounded by shadows and whispers, I felt the full weight of my isolation and the terrible truth that the boundary between life and death here was not a line but a haze, shifting and treacherous. The shade was waiting, patient and eternal, and I was running out of time, As the night deepened, so did the shadows. The glowing eyes faded into the fog, but their menace lingered, a promise that the next encounter would come, and soon. I had glimpsed the true face of the darkness that haunted this island. Now I had to find a way to face it, or be swallowed whole. But even as I resolved to fight, a whisper curled in my ear, soft, insistent, and chilling in its intimacy. Elias. The name was no longer just a call. It was a summons, and the graveyard was breathing, waiting for me to answer. The night air was thick and heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow sound whole. The fog, a persistent shroud, curled around the tombstones like spectral fingers, damp and cold. I followed Mara down the wending path between the graves, her footsteps soft on the earth, her face set with grim determination. "This is the heart of it," she whispered, pausing beneath the twisted branches of an ancient oak that stood sentinel over the oldest part of the cemetery. "If the whispers have a source, it's here." The moon was hidden behind a curtain of clouds, casting the island into near darkness. I could barely make out the shapes of the gravestones, their marble faces mottled with time and moss. The silence was broken only by the distant, hollow sighs of the sea and the faint rustle of dead leaves stirred by a cold breeze. Mara reached into her satchel and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in worn cloth. Unfolding it, she revealed a collection of herbs, sage, rosemary, and a handful of salt crystals. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she scattered the salt in a wide circle around us, the crystals catching what little light there was and glinting like tiny stars against the dark soil. "Salt is a boundary," she explained softly. "It keeps the restless at bay, at least for a time." I knelt beside her, the damp earth cold against my knees. The whispers were faint but persistent, a low susurration that seemed to crawl up from the ground itself. They called my name, weaving through the fog and penetrating the silence like a poison. Mara began to chant, her voice low and melodic, carrying the cadence of a language I didn't understand but felt deep in my bones. Her words rose and fell like waves, drawing invisible lines in the air, binding and shielding us. As she chanted, I felt the atmosphere shift. The whispers faltered, their insidious call losing strength. The fog seemed to recoil slightly, as if the ritual carved a small sanctuary amidst the oppressive gloom. A tremor of relief surged through me, fragile and tentative. I glanced at Mara, her eyes closed in concentration, her dark hair pulled back tightly. There was a fierce hope in her stance, a belief that this ancient rite could hold back the darkness, even if only momentarily. Minutes stretched, the night holding its breath. Then, gradually, the whispers that had clung to my mind loosened their grip. The voices faded into silence, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant call of a night bird. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the cemetery was still. The salt circle glowed faintly in the moonlight that broke through the clouds, a fragile barrier against the creeping shadows. Mara opened her eyes and a wary smile touched her lips. "It's working," she said. "But we can't rely on it forever. The shade is patient." I nodded, feeling the weight on my chest ease. The ritual had not banished the darkness, but it had carved out a moment of peace, a brief respite where I could breathe without the whispers clawing at my sanity. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I don't know if I could face another night without this." She placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Elias. But you will need every ounce of that strength for what's coming." As dawn's first pale light pierced the horizon, the fog began to lift, revealing the jagged outline of the island's cliffs and the restless sea beyond. The cemetery lay quiet behind us, its breath stilled for now, but I knew the peace was precarious. The ritual had given me hope, a fleeting clarity amid the shadows. But the whispering shade was still out there, lurking beneath the earth, waiting. And I had to be ready to face it, no matter the cost. With Mara by my side and the salt circle etched in the soil, I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The silence around me a fragile promise that I would fight for the island, and for myself until the very end. The night was still young, and the whispers would return. But for now, I had a moment to gather my resolve. The graveyard that breathed in sleep had been quieted, if only for a time, and that was enough to keep me going. But as the sun climbed higher, shadows lengthened, and a chilling certainty settled in my bones. The battle was far from over, and the whispers had only just begun their slow, relentless call. The night weighed heavily on me, thick as the fog that clung to the island's bones. The candle flickered in the corner of my cabin, casting shadows that danced like memories I could not outrun. I sat at the rickety wooden table, clutching a photograph worn smooth by years of trembling fingers. It was Lily, her face frozen in time, innocent and fragile, the kind of smile that could cleave your heart in two. I traced the edges of the picture, my breath shallow and ragged. The whispers had grown louder these past nights, their soft murmurs curling around my mind like smoke. They weren't random anymore. They were calling me out, pulling me back to that day, the day everything shattered. The accident. I closed my eyes, and the room dissolved into the past. I was there standing by the cliff's edge, the wind howling like a banshee through the gnarled branches. Lily had been running ahead, laughter bright and unguarded, unaware of the treacherous ground beneath her feet. I shouted, my voice cracking, but it was too late. The earth gave way, and she was gone, swallowed by the unforgiving shadows below. The memory was a jagged scar, raw and bleeding. I had blamed myself for years, the words I never said, the steps I never took. The whispers echoed her name, a cruel reminder of my failure. I was the gravedigger, but I had buried more than just bodies. I had buried my own soul beneath layers of regret. A sudden coldness brushed my neck, and I turned sharply. There she was, Lily, not in flesh, but a wraith of light and sorrow. Her eyes, deep pools of silent accusation, met mine. She didn't speak, but her presence was a scream I couldn't ignore. Elias, the whispers breathed, threading through the cracks in the walls and seeping from the earth beneath my feet. I staggered back, heart hammering. The boundary between past and present, life and death, was dissolving. The island was alive with grief, and it held me captive. Days later, Mara's knock shattered the bleak silence. She looked at me with those sharp, steady eyes, a beacon amid the storm. You have to face it, she said softly, stepping inside. The whispers, the guilt, it's all tangled. But you can't run from yourself anymore. Her words were a bomb, fragile but real. Together, we sifted through old journals, letters, and records, fragments of other lives lost to the island's dark embrace. The history was stained with sorrow, a tapestry of pain that fed the shade's hunger. As I stared into the fog-shrouded cemetery again, the soil beneath my boots pulsed faintly, a heartbeat of darkness. The whispers were no longer just voices. They were a force, relentless and insidious, binding me tighter to this cursed ground. But beneath the weight of despair, a spark flickered. Acceptance was not surrender, it was the first step toward breaking free. The shadows lengthened, and the night deepened, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sliver of resolve. The past was a grave I could no longer avoid digging up, and the whispers, they would have to wait. The night held its breath, waiting for my next move. The night had thickened around me, the fog curling like smoke through the gnarled branches and settling heavily over the cemetery. I stood still among the rows of weathered headstones, their inscriptions blurred by time and moisture. The damp earth beneath my boots exhaling a cold breath that chilled me to the bone. The whispers were growing louder now, not just distant murmurs, but a persistent, insistent calling that seemed to seep up through the soil itself. I knelt down, placing my hands on the cold ground, the dirt damp and soft beneath my fingers. At first, it was just the chill of the earth, but then a strange sensation began to pulse beneath my palms, a rhythmic throbbing, like the slow, steady beat of a heart hidden beneath layers of dirt and stone. My breath hitched, and a shiver ran down my spine. The cemetery was alive, not in any natural sense, but with something darker, something ancient and hungry. The whispering voices rose again, curling around me like tendrils of fog, swirling and thickening until they nearly drowned out the sound of the waves crashing against the island's jagged cliffs. I could hear my name, clear and unmistakable, echoing from beneath the soil. Elias, Elias. I pulled back my hands, the earth pulsing still but now accompanied by a sensation of movement beneath the surface. The ground seemed to shift, as if something was stirring, restless and eager to be free. My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of years of guilt and sorrow pressing down on me like the heavy fog. A sudden stirring of shadows caught my eye. Along the edges of the gravestones, the mist seemed to darken and ripple. Shapes formed, amorphous and shifting, with faintly glowing eyes that pierced the gloom. They flickered in and out of sight, elusive yet unmistakably watching, waiting. The whispering shade was revealing itself, no longer content to lurk in the background. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay rooted in the moment. The earth beneath me was more than a resting place for the dead, it was a conduit, a vessel for the shade's terrible power. Every pulse of the soil was a heartbeat in its twisted rhythm, every whisper a thread in its binding spell. My mind raced as I pieced together the fragments of what Mara had told me, the restless spirits, the ancient curses, the collective sorrow that fed this malevolent force. The cemetery was a prison and a predator, trapping souls and feeding on their pain. And now it was using me, pulling me closer with every breath it exhaled from the ground. I stood slowly, my hands trembling but my resolve hardening. This was no longer just a place of death, it was a battleground. If the earth itself could pulse with this dark energy, then perhaps understanding its rhythm could be the key to fighting back. But the cost would be high. The whispering shade was patient and relentless, born of centuries of anguish and violence. I took a deep breath, the fog thick around me, and whispered back into the night. I'm not yours to take, not yet. The soil pulsed once more beneath my feet, a slow, steady beat that echoed in my bones. The whispers softened, retreating into the earth for now, but I knew it was only a reprieve. The graveyard was alive, and it had marked me. The question was whether I could survive what was coming. As I retreated from the heart of the cemetery, the fog seemed to close in tighter, the shadows watching and waiting. The pulse of the earth followed me, a reminder that beneath the stillness, the graveyard breathed, and it was far from silent. I had uncovered a terrible truth tonight. The ground beneath the graves was not merely soil and stone, but a living, breathing entity entwined with the whispering shade. It was a dark heart beating beneath the island, feeding on guilt, sorrow, and death. And I was caught in its rhythm, a prisoner to its pulse. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but I could no longer deny what I felt beneath my skin and heard in the whispers carried on the fog. The cemetery was alive, and I was part of its story now, whether I liked it or not. I tightened my coat against the chill and turned toward the edge of the island, where Mara waited with answers and perhaps a way to fight back. The cemetery's pulse was a warning and a challenge, and I was ready to listen. The night settled over the island like a suffocating shroud, thick fog curling around the twisted headstones and gnarled trees of the cemetery. I stood at the heart of that breathing earth, the soil beneath my boots trembling with a life of its own. The air was sharp, biting, and cold enough to steal the breath from my lungs. It was as though the island itself was holding its breath, waiting. I gripped the handle of my shovel tighter, knuckles whitening as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, no longer mere murmurs, but voices that clawed at my sanity. They spoke my name over and over, a relentless chant echoing from the soil. Elias, Elias. From the depths of the fog, the whispering shade emerged. It was not a shape but a shifting mass of shadow and mist, eyes glowing faintly like embers in the dark. The very ground seemed to pulse with its presence, the earth exhaling a cold breath that chilled me to my core. This was the moment I had dreaded, yet prepared for a confrontation, not just with a spirit, but with the embodiment of the island's sorrow and my own guilt. I know what you want, I said, my voice trembling but resolute, cutting through the oppressive silence. You feed on guilt and fear. You want to claim me like the others. But I'm not ready to go, not yet. The shade rippled, a low moan emanating from the soil as it responded not with words, but with images flooding my mind. Faces of the dead, twisted in pain and rage. Memories of the island's darkest tragedies. And then my sister Lily, her face pale, and ghostly eyes accusing. The weight of my failure pressed down on me, threatening to crush what remained of my resolve. I staggered but forced myself upright. I'm not your prisoner, I whispered, swallowing the bitter taste of despair. There has to be another way. The shade's eyes glowed brighter, the shadows swirling faster, suffocating the light around me. The whispers morphed into a cacophony of voices, each a fragment of sorrow and rage, pulling at the threads of my mind. But I clung to the shovel, the cold metal, a reminder of the life I still held on to. What do you want from me? I demanded, voice cracking but fierce. The shade's presence shifted, and for a fleeting moment, I sensed something beyond malice, a hunger born from centuries of pain and loss. It was not evil in the simple sense, but a force sustained by the unresolved anguish of every soul buried in the ground beneath us. I seek release, I said aloud, surprising myself with the words. If there's a way to break this cycle, tell me. The whispers softened, the soil stilled, and the shade's eyes dimmed slightly. The night around me held its breath again. Then slowly the soil seemed to draw back, the shadows receding into the mist. Exhausted, I sank to my knees, the fog swirling thickly around me. I had faced the darkness and bargained for my life, but I knew this was only the beginning. The shade was patient, eternal. It would wait, and I had to be ready for its next summons. As dawn threatened the horizon, I rose, the weight of the earth still heavy on my shoulders. The whispers faded to a low murmur, but their echo lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder that the battle for my soul was far from over. And somewhere deep beneath the ground, the shade waited, watching, breathing, and biding its time. The graveyard had spoken, and I had answered. But would my answer be enough? I clutched my shovel tighter, stepping away from the trembling earth as the first pale light of morning seeped through the fog, knowing that the desperate bargain I had made tonight might be the only thing standing between me and eternal darkness. The night had tested me, and though I had not yet fallen, the path ahead was shrouded in shadow and dread, promising more whispers, more visions, and the unrelenting pull of the graveyard that refused to let me go. I would need every ounce of strength and every shred of courage to face what was coming next. The low light in Mara's study flickered as the evening wore on, shadows dancing across the scattered relics of a past long buried beneath years of salt, fog, and grief. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and damp wood, a fitting atmosphere for the secrets she was about to unfold. I sat opposite her, my hands trembling slightly as they rested on the worn surface of the table cluttered with yellowed maps, brittle diaries, and artifacts from the island's earliest days. You need to understand, Mara began, voice steady but heavy with the weight of what she was about to reveal. This island's curse didn't come from nowhere. It's born from the blood and sorrow of generations. I leaned in, my heart thudding with a mix of dread and desperate hope. The whispers beneath my feet had grown louder these past weeks, no longer just faint murmurs, but a persistent call that gnawed at my sanity. I needed to know what I was truly facing. Mara spread a brittle manuscript out before me, its edges frayed and ink faded. The first settlers, your ancestors, Elias came here seeking a fresh start. But the island wasn't welcoming. Tragedy struck early. A feud erupted between the founding families, fueled by jealousy, greed, and fear. It tore the community apart like a storm ripping through the trees. Her fingers traced the names on a faded family tree, pausing over the branches that connected to my own lineage. I swallowed hard, feeling the cold grip of history tighten around me. They fought over land, over promises broken, over the very survival of the island. Blood was spilled, innocents and guilty alike. A sudden gust rattled the window panes, as if the island itself shuddered at the mention of those dark deeds. The whispers seemed to creep in, carried by the wind, threading through the cracks and settling around us like a living presence. Mara's eyes flickered toward the window, her expression hardening. That violence seeded something terrible, she continued. The whispering shade is no mere ghost, it's the embodiment of all that sorrow, rage, and guilt left unresolved. It feeds on the pain of the lost, binding them here, and it grows stronger with every death that goes unacknowledged. I felt the weight of her words settle in my chest like a stone. The cemetery wasn't just a resting place, it was a crucible for the island's anguish, a living trap for souls caught between life and death. The ground beneath my feet, the very earth I dug and tended, was tainted with centuries of torment. And the whispers? I asked, voice barely above a whisper. They were the shade's call, Mara said grimly, a summons for those burdened with guilt like you. It knows your pain, Elias, it hungers for it. Silence fell between us, thick and suffocating. I stared down at the family tree again, the names blurring as memories surged. My sister Lily's face flickered in my mind, her laughter, the accident, the crushing guilt that drove me away from the island and back into this nightmare. Is there a way to stop it? I asked, desperation creeping into my tone. Mara met my gaze, eyes fierce. There's always a way, but it's dangerous. You have to confront the past, accept the truth buried in the shadows. Only then can the cycle be broken. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the dying light of day. The whispers seeped through the cracks in the window, soft yet insistent, a reminder that the island's curse was far from over. I clenched my fists, feeling the sting of dirt beneath my nails, the pulse of the earth beneath me. This was no longer just about survival. It was about redemption for me, for the island, for the restless souls trapped in the soil that breathed beneath us. The night stretched on, and as Mara continued to recount the island's tragic history, I realized the path forward would demand everything I had and more. But I was ready, or at least I hoped I was, because the whispering shade was no longer just a distant menace. It was a presence woven into the very fabric of the island's cursed heart, and it was coming for me. The night was a suffocating shroud, thick fog curling around the twisted iron crosses like ghostly fingers trying to pull me under. Each breath I took was heavy with moisture and the faint scent of damp earth, the graveyard's signature perfume, a reminder that I was never far from death. The whispers had started again, not just faint murmurs, but a relentless tide washing over my thoughts, drowning out reason. I stumbled forward, boots sinking slightly into the soft soil, each step accompanied by the low, shivering breath of the earth beneath me. The voices were louder now, layered in a maddening chorus that teased and tormented. They called my name alias, but it was never a simple summoning. It was a question, a demand, a cruel echo of every regret that clawed at my soul. My hands trembled as I pressed them to my temples, desperate to quiet the storm within my mind. "Stop," I whispered hoarsely, but the voices only surged, twisting my memories into grotesque shapes. The tragic image of Lily flashed before me, her bright eyes dimmed in the haze of that terrible day, the accident that I could never undo. The weight of that guilt was no longer just a burden. It was a living thing, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Suddenly, the world shifted. The fog thickened, and the cemetery around me blurred and dissolved into a twisted dreamscape. Lily was there, pale and translucent, her form flickering like a candle flame in a draught. Her eyes held an unspoken sorrow, but also a strange calm. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said softly, her voice both a balm and a blade. "The whispers aren't just torment. They want release." I reached out, but my hand passed through her like mist. "How?" I asked, voice cracking. Her form wavered. "By facing the darkness within." The vision shattered, and I found myself gasping on the cold ground, the whispers now a sinister hiss crawling through the soil. From the shadows, the whispering shade emerged, its amorphous form shifting with the fog, eyes glowing faintly like dying embers. It reached for me, tendrils of shadow curling around my ankles, dragging me toward the earth. "You belong here," it murmured with a voice like 1,000 sighs. "Your guilt feeds me. Your sorrow binds you." Panic surged through me, igniting a desperate fight. I clawed at the ground, breaking the shade's grip momentarily. But the hallucinations deepened. The trees twisted into monstrous shapes, and the graves seemed to open their mouths in silent screams. My mind teetered on the edge of oblivion. In the midst of the chaos, a fleeting thought anchored me: Mara's fierce determination, her belief that this cycle could be broken. Clinging to that hope, I forced myself to stand, pushing back against the darkness that threatened to consume me. The whispers faltered, the shade recoiling as if stung. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by my ragged breathing and the distant crashing of waves against the rocky shore. But I knew this was only the beginning. My mind was fractured, my soul bruised, and the night was far from over. The battle for my sanity had just begun, and the shadows were patient. I had to find a way back from this brink or be lost forever to the graveyard that breathed in sleep. And as I stumbled away from the abyss, the whispers softened, but the dread remained, a dark promise that the shade was waiting, watching, and hungry still. The night was thick with fog, a suffocating blanket that pressed against the small windows of Mara's study. Shelves heaved under the weight of dusty books and brittle papers, their contents whispering secrets of the island's grim past. The flickering lantern cast dancing shadows across Mara's stern face, her sharp eyes scanning a faded manuscript as I leaned close, desperate to absorb every fragment of knowledge. "This passage," she said quietly, "speaks of an old right one meant to calm restless spirits and sever the bonds they cling to. It's fragile, but it might give you the strength you need." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. The whispers had grown relentless again, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. But here, with Mara's steady presence, I felt a fragile thread of hope. "I can't do this alone," I admitted. "The shadows, they press in harder each night." Her gaze softened. "You're not alone. We'll face this together." Later, beneath a hooded sky veiled in swirling mist, I found myself standing among the tombstones, the cold earth beneath my boots whispering faintly, calling my name. The wind tangled through the gnarled branches overhead, carrying the scent of damp soil and decayed leaves. My voice broke the silence as I whispered, "Lily," into the night. The name hung between the gravestones, a fragile bridge between past and present, life and death. The murmurs rose in response, but I clenched my fists, grounding myself in the moment. "Not tonight," I vowed. Back at Mara's cottage, the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs. She chanted softly, weaving old island words into the night air while circling a small fire. Her voice was a steady anchor amid the storm raging inside me. Watching her, I felt a flicker of calm ignite within the chaos, a spark of defiance against the creeping darkness. When the ritual ended, silence settled like a balm. For the first time in days, the shadows seemed to retreat, the oppressive weight lifting, just enough to breathe. I returned to my Spartan room, the shadows lingering but less hostile. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling but heart steadied by the knowledge that I was not yet lost. The graveyard still whispered, still waited, but so did I tonight. The fight was not over, but for the first time, I believed I had a chance. And as sleep edged closer, the fog outside thickened, curling tendrils brushing the window pane like spectral fingers, reminders that the battle for my soul was only just beginning. The night had thickened into a suffocating cloak of fog that seemed to swallow every shadow, every whisper, every breath. I stood at the edge of the cemetery, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth that pulsed beneath me like a living heart. The ground exhaled again, faint, almost inaudible at first, but unmistakably calling my name. "Elias, Elias." The voice was a rasp, as if dragged from the depths of a long-forgotten grave, curling through the mist like a spectral serpent. The air tasted of decay and damp moss, and I could feel the weight of the island pressing down on me with every labored breath. Mara was beside me, her sharp eyes scanning the shifting shadows that clung to the gnarled trees lining the cemetery's perimeter. "It's getting worse," she whispered, her voice taut with urgency. "The shade is growing stronger." I nodded, swallowing the lump forming in my throat. The whispering shade was no longer content to murmur from the earth's depths. It was manifesting with a force that twisted the very fabric of this cursed place. The restless dead stirred beneath the soil, their sorrow and rage bubbling to the surface like oil slicks on water. A sudden tremor ran through the ground, subtle at first but building steadily until the earth beneath us seemed to breathe with sinister life. I pressed my palms against the cold stone of an ancient headstone, feeling it vibrate beneath my touch. The whispering voices swelled into a chorus fragmented, anguished, desperate, a symphony of torment that clawed at the edges of my sanity. "We need to act," Mara said, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of lantern light. "If the shade feeds on guilt and fear, then we must find a way to starve it." I looked away from her, focusing instead on the shifting fog where shapes began to coalesce, the restless spirits of the island rising from their shallow graves, their forms indistinct yet filled with palpable misery. Their eyes, hollow and glassy, met mine briefly before they drifted like ghosts in the wind. The whispering shade took shape, a shifting mass of darkness with eyes glowing faintly like embers in a dying fire. It weaved through the tombstones, its presence chilling the air, sucking warmth and hope from the night. A low growl resonated in my chest, an ancient fear igniting a primal urge to flee. "You can't run from this," Mara said, catching my gaze. "You rebound to this island, to this cemetery. But together, we might find a way to end its hunger." My mind reeled with memories, Lily's face shattered by that terrible accident, the endless nights haunted by whispered regrets. The shade fed on these fragments of my broken soul, weaving them into its dark tapestry. But Mara's words lit a fragile ember of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. Thunder rolled in the distance, a storm gathering beyond the horizon, its breath stirring the skeletal branches above us. The wind carried the whispers, now a roaring tide of sorrow and warning. The island itself seemed to brace for the final reckoning, the boundaries between the living and the dead fraying under the shade's relentless assault. I tightened my grip on the shovel I carried, a tool of death and survival, and took a step forward into the swirling mist. Mara followed close behind, her steady presence a bulwark against the rising tide of fear that threatened to consume me. The gathering storm was not just in the sky, but in the soil beneath my feet and the shadows that danced with malevolent will. The whispering shade was calling me home, to a fate I had long dreaded but could no longer deny. The battle for my soul, for the island's redemption, was about to begin. And in that moment, with the cold fog wrapping around us like a shroud, I knew there was no turning back. The night air was thick with fog, damp and cold, seeping into my bones as I made my way through the cemetery's twisted paths. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself resisted my presence. The whispers had grown louder over the past weeks, no longer faint murmurs, but urgent calls curling from beneath the soil, threading through the mist like invisible fingers. Tonight they were relentless. I paused beside a freshly turned grave, the earth still soft and warm beneath my boots. The name etched on the weathered headstone caught the moonlight, one of the island's forgotten souls. The whispers swelled around me, a chorus of voices both plaintive and accusing. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound only penetrated deeper, burrowing into my mind. It was no longer just voices, it was a force pulling at me, tugging me toward the ground, toward oblivion. I tried to step back, but the earth beneath my feet seemed to pulse, a slow, rhythmic breathing that matched my faltering heartbeat. The fog thickened, swirling around me, turning the world into a blur of shadow and sound. Shapes moved at the edge of my vision, shifting masses of darkness with eyes that gleamed faintly like dying embers. The whispering shade was here, its presence palpable, crushing. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees, gasping for breath as a cold weight pressed against my chest. The soil seemed alive, crawling up my arms, seeping into my clothes, pulling me downward. Panic surged through me, but I was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The voices overlapped, chanting my name, whispering of death and surrender. Just as the darkness began to consume my vision, a voice pierced the chaos, clear, commanding, and fierce. "Elias!" Mara's figure emerged from the mist, her eyes blazing with determination. She knelt beside me, grabbing my arm and holding me upright. Her grip was steady, a lifeline in the sea of despair. "Fight it, Elias," she urged, her breath visible in the cold air. "You re stronger than it wants you to believe." I clung to her words, though my body trembled with exhaustion and fear. The whispering shade recoiled, its glowing eyes narrowing as it retreated into the fog. But the menace lingered, a promise that this was far from over. As I caught my breath, fragmented memories flickered through my mind, Lily's laughter echoing on a summer afternoon, the sudden crash, the cold silence that followed. The guilt that had gnawed at me for years now burned with renewed intensity. But alongside it was something new, a fragile ember of defiance. I looked at Mara, gratitude and resolve mingling in my gaze. The battle was not just for my life, but for my soul, for the chance to break free from the shadows that had haunted me for so long. The cemetery's grip was deadly, but I was not yet lost. The fog whispered around us, a sibilant reminder of the darkness still lurking beneath the earth. But in that moment, with Mara by my side and the will to fight ignited within me, I dared to hope. The graveyard was alive, and it wanted me dead. But I would not go quietly into that endless night. The fog hung heavy over the island cemetery, a thick, suffocating cloak that swallowed sound and light alike. I stood alone by Lily's grave, the cold earth beneath my boots seeming to pulse faintly, almost like a slow, uneven heartbeat. The whispers had grown louder tonight, no longer faint murmurs but a chorus of voices rising and falling in a haunting rhythm. Yet amid the cacophony, my own name rang clear sharp, accusing, impossible to ignore. I clenched my fists, dirt-streaked and trembling, and stared down at the weathered headstone carved with my sister's name. The letters were worn by time and rain, but to me they bore the weight of every regret I had carried since that terrible day. A day I had tried to forget, but that the island, this cursed place, refused to let me escape. The memory surged forward, vivid and unrelenting. Lily had been laughing that afternoon, her bright eyes sparkling with the careless joy of youth. I remember the way the sun had caught her hair, turning it into a halo of gold. Then the accident, the slip, the scream, the cold plunge into the dark waters. I had tried to save her, but my hands had been slow, my heart slower still. She was gone before I could reach her. Guilt had been my shadow ever since, a weight heavier than any grave I dug. It had driven me away from the island once, but the whispers pulled me back, like chains forged from sorrow and silence. Now, as the night pressed down around me, I realized the only way to break free was to face the truth no matter how painful. "Lily," I whispered, voice cracking. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The air shimmered, and for a moment, the fog parted to reveal her. Not as she was in life, but as a spectral echo, pale and trembling, eyes soft with sadness, but touched with something else, forgiveness. She reached out, a fragile smile flickering on her lips, a candle's flame in the darkness. "Elias," she said, voice like a breath on the wind. "You are not alone." Tears blurred my vision as the whispers swelled, some voices turning gentle, almost soothing. The ground beneath me no longer felt like a trap, but a passage one I had to walk to find peace. I spoke again, this time not just the words of regret, but of acceptance. "I was scared. I was selfish. But I want to make this right. Help me." The whispering shade stirred, its presence looming like a suffocating fog, but the chains around my heart began to loosen. The island's darkness seemed less absolute, the night less endless. I knew the fight was far from over. The curse was ancient and cruel, and my sins were not easily forgiven. But in that moment, Beneath the whispering soil and the watchful eyes of ghost and fog, I took the first step toward breaking free. The weight of my guilt still pressed down, but for the first time in years, it felt possible to carry it without being crushed. As the vision of Lily faded back into the mist, I whispered a promise. I won't let this place claim me. Not yet. The air grew still, the whispers softened, and the night held its breath. The island was waiting, watching, and so was I. The graveyard that breathed in sleep was alive, but perhaps so was I, and that made all the difference. The night was thick with fog, each breath I drew tasting damp and cold, like the earth itself had exhaled its sorrow into the air. Mara and I stood in the center of the cemetery, surrounded by weathered stones whose inscriptions had long since blurred into indecipherable marks. The moon was absent, swallowed by a blanket of clouds that swallowed the island's faint light entirely, leaving us in a darkness so complete it felt alive. Mara knelt carefully on the damp ground, her fingers deftly tracing shapes in the dirt. I watched as she drew the ancient symbols, shed uncovered in the dusty pages of that old diary, a language of the island, whispered down through generations, believed to hold power over the restless dead. Her chalk glowed faintly, neon blue against the earth, illuminating the circle of runes around us in the eerie half-light. "This is the boundary," she murmured, her voice low and steady despite the tension wrapping around us like the fog. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. The whispers had grown louder these past nights, their insistent call clawing at the edges of my sanity. To stand here now, preparing to challenge the malevolent force that had haunted me for weeks, felt like walking straight into a nightmare I couldn't awake from. "Are you ready?" Mara asked, looking up at me with sharp eyes that reflected determination rather than fear. I clenched my fists, feeling the grit and coldness of the soil beneath my nails. "I have to be, for Lily. For this island." She handed me the brittle pages from the diary, the incantation written in faded ink that twisted and curled like the branches of the island's ancient trees. The words felt foreign on my tongue, heavy with meaning and danger. I took a deep breath and began to speak, my voice barely above a whisper at first. "By the sorrow of those lost and the weight of the forgotten, I call upon the light to sever the chains that bind us all." As I continued, the ground beneath us seemed to pulse, the soil shifting subtly, as if the earth itself was listening, responding. The whispers that had tormented me for weeks swirled around our feet, a chorus of voices rising and falling like the tide. Fear gripped my heart. Was the whispering shade angry? Was it gathering strength? Mara stepped closer, her hand finding mine. The warmth was a lifeline, grounding me amidst the encroaching darkness. "Keep going," she urged. The wind picked up suddenly, cold and sharp, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and decay. Shadows flickered at the edge of the circle, amorphous and shifting, eyes glowing faintly in the mist. I could feel the shade's presence, a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest, trying to drag me under. But I held on, my voice growing stronger despite the trembling in my limbs. We were fighting not just for ourselves, but for every soul trapped in this cursed place. As the final words left my lips, a hush fell over the graveyard. The whispers faltered, then faded, leaving a silence so profound it pressed against my ears. The fog seemed to thin, the heavy air lightening just enough to let in a sliver of dawn's first pale light. Mara exhaled slowly, releasing the tension I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "It's not over," she said softly, "but we've broken the cycle. For now." I nodded, the weight of exhaustion and relief washing over me. The island was still scarred, still heavy with sorrow, but tonight, the graveyard had finally ceased its relentless murmuring. Yet even as hope flickered in my chest, a part of me knew the darkness was patient. It would wait, it would watch. And when the time came, it would call my name again. For now, though, we had won a fragile peace. And that was enough to keep me moving forward into the uncertain dawn. The fog clung to the island like a suffocating shroud, thick and unyielding, as I stepped into the heart of the cemetery. The ground beneath my boots shivered, a subtle tremor that soon swelled into a low, almost imperceptible rumble. Around me shadows twisted and writhed darker than the night itself, coalescing into shapes that defied the natural order. The whispering shade was here, its presence a living nightmare born from the soil and sorrow of this cursed place. I clenched my fists, the sting of dirt beneath my fingernails a reminder of all the nights spent digging graves, burying secrets as much as bodies. My breath formed clouds in the cold air, mingling with the damp scent of earth and decay. The shade's eyes glowed faintly through the mist pools of malevolent light that seemed to peer into the very marrow of my bones. Elias. The voice slithered through the fog, a susurrus of whispers threading together into my name, each syllable dripping with malice and promise. Come to us. Rest with us. I forced my legs to move forward, despite the gnawing dread clawing at my mind. The shade stretched out tendrils of shadow, reaching for me like the fingers of the dead, cold and relentless. But I would not give in, not tonight. From the edge of the graveyard, Mara's voice rose, steady and resolute. She stood amid a circle of stones, her hands weaving intricate patterns in the air as she intoned an ancient incantation. The words felt like a balm and a battle cry, piercing the oppressive silence. The whispers recoiled, entangled in her chant, as the fog swirled violently, responding to her will. "Hold on, Elias," she called, eyes blazing with fierce determination. "You are not alone." The shade hissed in frustration, the shadows writhing with renewed fury. My vision blurred, and suddenly I was no longer just in the cemetery. I was back in that sun-dappled clearing where Lily had laughed moments before the accident, her smile radiant, innocent. Then the scene shifted, darkening into a twisted tableau of silence and loss. Her ghostly form flickered before me, eyes wide with unspoken questions and silent accusation. "I'm sorry," I whispered, voice cracking, tears mingling with the cold mist on my cheeks. "I should have saved you." Her apparition wavered, the anger in her gaze softening into something like understanding or perhaps forgiveness. But the shade was relentless, feeding on my torment, its shadows swallowing the light. Summoning every shred of strength, I shouted into the night, "I accept it. I accept my guilt."
"But I refuse to be your prisoner!"
The ground trembled violently, the whispers rising into a deafening roar that threatened to shatter my sanity. Shadows recoiled as a blinding light erupted from my chest, fueled by raw, painful acceptance. The shade screamed a soundless, soul-wrenching cry before dissipating into the earth, leaving behind only a cold, eerie silence. I collapsed onto the dew-soaked grass, chest heaving, every muscle trembling. Mara rushed to my side, her hand steady on my shoulder. "It's not over," she said softly. "But you've broken its hold for now." As dawn crept over the horizon, the fog began to lift, and with it, the suffocating weight that had held this island in thrall. I looked once more at the cemetery, quiet, still, but forever marked by the battle waged beneath its sodden earth. The whispers had paused, but the memory of their call lingered, a haunting refrain beneath the rising sun. And in that fragile silence, I found the faintest glimmer of hope, a chance to finally lay the restless dead, and my own tortured past, to rest. But the island had its secrets, and I knew deep down the shade might return. After all, some shadows never truly die. The night air was thick with fog, curling around the gnarled trees and moss-covered headstones like a living thing. I stood in the heart of the cemetery, the earth beneath my boots, pulsing faintly, as if breathing in rhythm with the restless souls it held captive. Around me, the whispering shade coalesced into shifting shadows, its faintly glowing eyes watching, waiting. The oppressive weight of its presence pressed against my chest, a dark tide threatening to pull me under. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, I wasn't running from the past. Tonight, I wasn't trying to silence the whispers or ignore the voices that clawed at my mind. Tonight, I faced them. "I'm here," I said aloud, my voice raw but steady, cutting through the thick silence. "I know why you're here. I know what you want." The shade's murmuring grew louder, a cacophony of sorrow and accusation swirling around me. The whispers echoed fragments of my own guilt, memories of Lily's laughter turned to screams, the accident I could never undo. But instead of shrinking back, I took a breath and stepped forward. "I'm sorry," I whispered, voice breaking. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry for leaving, I'm sorry for everything. But I'm not yours to take. Not tonight." The shadows flickered, their glowing eyes dimming for a heartbeat before flaring anew, angry and confused. I could feel the shade's grip loosening, the dark tendrils of its influence recoiling from my confession. It was as if by naming my pain, I was stealing its power. Beside me, Mara's voice rose in a low chant, ancient syllables that seemed to weave through the fog like a protective spell. She moved gracefully, lighting candles arranged in a circle of salt and herbs around us. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows that danced among the tombstones, pushing back the darkness, even as the shade writhed and hissed. "Keep steady, Elias," Mara urged, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "You redoing this. You rebreaking the cycle." I closed my eyes and reached down, letting my trembling hand brush against the cold, damp soil. The earth beneath my fingers felt strange, no longer cold and hostile, but faintly warm, alive in a way that didn't terrify me. A fragile connection sparked between me and the island, between the living and the dead. The whispers faded, retreating to distant murmurs barely audible over the chorus of the night's natural sounds. The heavy fog began to lift slowly, revealing the worn faces of headstones bathed in pale moonlight. For the first time in months, the cemetery felt quiet, no longer a prison of torment, but a place suspended between worlds, fragile and still. I opened my eyes and met Mara's gaze, the exhaustion in her face mirroring my own. We had risked everything tonight, confronting the ancient darkness that had fed on generations of sorrow. But in that moment, hope flickered a fragile flame against the encroaching shadows. "It's not over," Mara said softly, "but the shade's hold is breaking. We've bought the island some time." I nodded, feeling the weight of my guilt begin to shift, not disappear but become something I could carry. The cycle wasn't broken yet, but for the first time, I believed it could be. And as the first faint light of dawn touched the horizon, I whispered a promise not just to the restless dead beneath the soil, but to myself. I would fight to keep this fragile peace, no matter the cost, because some graves should never be left to breathe in darkness. But perhaps with courage and acceptance, even the deepest shadows could be chased away by the light. The island was still holding its breath, but so was I. And neither of us would falter, not tonight. The fog had thinned just enough to reveal the worn gravestones scattered across the island cemetery, their moss-covered surfaces glistening faintly in the pale moonlight. I stood motionless amidst them, the chill biting through my threadbare coat, my gaze fixed on the ground beneath my feet. The whispers, the murmurs that had haunted me relentlessly for weeks were fading, retreating back into the earth as though exhausted by some unseen force. It was as if the cemetery itself was exhaling a long, shuddering breath, releasing its hold on the restless dead. Yet, where there had once been a cacophony of voices calling my name, there was now only a heavy silence, dense and weighty, pressing down on my chest like a stone. Mara was nearby, her lantern casting a warm glow over the oldest tombstones. She knelt beside one, tracing the faded inscriptions carved into the granite with careful fingers. "The island's sorrows," she murmured, her voice low and reverent, "have always been buried here, entwined with the land itself. But tonight it seems that burden has begun to lift." I nodded, though the relief I felt was tempered by a gnawing unease. The shadows lingered longer than they should have, and the silence felt less like peace and more like the calm before a storm yet to come. "Do you think it's over?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mara looked up, her eyes reflecting the flickering light. "For now," she replied. "But grief like this doesn't disappear overnight. It seeps into the stones, the soil, even the air. We've quieted the shade, but we haven't erased the pain." A cold wind swept through the cemetery, carrying with it a faint echo like a sigh from the past. The whispering was gone, replaced by a soft rustling of leaves and the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of all I had witnessed. The malevolent presence that had gripped the island for so long was retreating, but the scars it left behind remained etched deep within the earth and my soul. I made my way slowly to Lily's grave, the rough stone chilled beneath my fingertips. The name carved, there was a constant reminder of my failures, and the guilt I had carried like a shroud. Tonight, though, as I closed my eyes and whispered her name, I felt something shift, a fragile thread of peace weaving through the darkness. "Goodbye, Lily," I said softly, my breath misting in the cold air. "I hope you can finally rest." The silence that followed was profound and absolute. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the graveyard that once breathed torment now lay still, its whispers faded to a memory. Yet, even as I turned away, a part of me knew the island's story was far from over. The shadows might sleep, but beneath the surface, the past waited patiently, ready to stir again when the time came. And as I left the cemetery, the weight of lingering dread settled around me like a cloak, reminding me that some ghosts never truly disappear. The night closed in, and the fog began to creep back over the island, swallowing the light and the silence alike. But for now, the graveyard was quiet, and I was free, if only for a while. The first light of dawn seeped through the dense canopy of fog that had clung stubbornly to the island all night. I stood at the edge of the cemetery, the earth beneath my boots still damp and cold from the lingering breath of night. The whispering had faded to a distant murmur, as if the graveyard itself was exhaling a long-held sigh of relief. The stones, worn and mottled with moss, caught the pale golden hues of the sun as it slowly ascended, casting long shadows that seemed less menacing than they had for so many nights before. The air was crisp, each breath visible in the chill morning. I inhaled deeply, tasting the salt of the nearby sea and the freshness of the island's ever-present pine. For once, the oppressive weight of the whispers did not press down on my chest. Instead, a fragile peace settled over me, a tentative balm to the years of torment. I traced my gaze over the rows of graves, each marker a story, a life, a memory whispered into the soil. Among them was Lily's resting place, simple and unadorned. Yet to me, it was the center of a storm that had raged inside my heart for too long. I felt the old ache, the guilt that had clawed at me since the accident, but now it was tempered by something new: acceptance. A crunch behind me pulled my attention. Mara peered from the path leading to the village, her dark hair pulled back in its habitual knot, eyes sharp yet softer than usual. She carried a small basket, the scent of herbs and bread wafting faintly in the cool air. "Morning," she said quietly, approaching. "Looks like the island's giving us a break." I nodded, motioning for her to join me by the ancient oak that marked the cemetery's boundary. We settled on a fallen log, the damp wood cool beneath us but steady. As we shared the simple meal, the silence between us was comfortable, punctuated only by the distant cries of gulls and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. "It's strange," Mara mused, breaking the quiet. "After all this time, the whispers have lessened. Not gone, but more like a fading echo." "I think it's because I stopped fighting them," I admitted. "For years, I tried to silence the voices, to outrun the guilt. But it clung to me, like the fog. Now I'm trying something different, acknowledging it." She looked at me, her gaze steady and understanding. "That's courage, Elias. It's not easy to face what haunts us." We spoke then of the island's future, of the fragile hope that the curse might one day be broken, that the restless dead might finally find rest. Mara's knowledge of ancient rituals and lore was a beacon in the darkness, and her friendship a tether to the living world I so often felt distant from. Later, as the sun climbed higher, I walked alone to Lily's grave. The wild flowers I gathered from the roadside were humble thistles and daisies, bright against the somber stone. Kneeling, I laid the bouquet gently on the earth, my hands trembling as I traced the letters of her name. "I'm sorry, Lily," I whispered, voice thick with emotion, "for everything. But I promise I won't let the past chain me anymore. You're a part of me always, but I'll carry your memory without letting it drag me down." The breeze stirred, carrying with it the faintest hint of a whisper, soft, distant, almost like a sigh. I closed my eyes, letting it wash over me, not with fear, but with a quiet acceptance. The island was still scarred, its history etched deep into the soil and souls of those who lived or died here. The shadows might linger in corners, and the whispers might never fully cease. But for the first time, I felt something I hadn't dared to hope for: peace. Not the kind that erases pain or forgets loss, but the kind that embraces it and makes room for healing. As I stood and turned toward the path leading back home, the fog began to lift more fully, revealing a sky streaked with the soft pinks and blues of morning. The graveyard that once breathed with torment now seemed to sleep, if only for a while, and for me, that was enough at least for now. But even as I walked away, a question lingered in my mind, as persistent as the whispers once were. Could this fragile peace hold? Or would the island's dark legacy rise again to claim me? Only time would tell. Until then, I would carry my burden with a little less weight, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to live alongside my ghosts rather than beneath them. The moment I had feared and longed for arrived with the fragile light of dawn creeping through the thick, unyielding fog. For years, the cemetery had been a place of restless murmurs and invisible breath, the soil alive with whispers that clawed at my sanity. Now, standing at the edge of the graveyard, I felt the weight of silence settle like a shroud over the broken earth. It was the first quiet morning in what felt like a lifetime. The cold air was still, the usual chorus of desperate voices absent. Beneath the dense mist, the gravestones stood like silent sentinels, their names worn by time and sorrow. I traced my gaze over the freshly filled grave where the whispering shade's final resistance had been broken. The earth beneath my feet no longer heaved or sighed. It was still, as if the graveyard itself had finally exhaled its last breath. Mara was by my side, her sharp eyes reflecting the pale light, as she prepared the last steps of our ritual. We had come here many times before, her knowledge of ancient rites and island lore guiding us through the darkness. Tonight, however, was different. There was no frantic urgency in her movements, only a steady, resolute calm. We moved together with the rhythm of the island's heartbeat, chanting words older than memory, weaving hope into the fog. The wind stirred gently, lifting the mist and revealing the cracked stones and tangled roots that had long concealed secrets beneath their surface. Our voices rose and fell, fragile yet fierce against the silence that had claimed the graveyard. As the sun's first rays pierced the veil of fog, a warmth spread through the cold air, and for a fleeting moment, the island felt alive with possibility. Yet, even as the last syllables of the ritual faded into the morning light, a shiver ran down my spine. I could not shake the feeling that the shadows still watched, waiting beneath the surface. The whispering shade might have been subdued, but it was not gone. It was a part of the island's soul, woven from centuries of sorrow and death, and it would always linger in the whispers between the stones. I remember walking the cemetery's perimeter at twilight, alone and vulnerable. The fog had begun to roll back in, thick and suffocating, swallowing the world in its cold embrace. The silence was so complete it pressed against my eardrums, broken only by the soft crunch of my boots on gravel. I paused by a weathered headstone, fingers brushing the rough surface, and then it came a faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I had imagined it. It was a fleeting touch on my ear, a ghost of a name, a memory I had tried so hard to bury. The whisper was gone before I could respond, leaving me with the lingering taste of salt and fear. It reminded me that though the graveyard slept, it was never truly at rest. Guilt and sorrow were seeds planted deep in this soil, their roots twisting through every stone and shadow. As the island awoke, The community gathered near the shoreline, watching the fog retreat and the sunlight conquer the morning gloom. Faces were drawn tight with the strain of years spent under the curse's shadow, but there was a flicker of hope in their eyes. Mara stood among them, a beacon of knowledge and strength, while I lingered apart, my gaze fixed on the quiet graveyard that had marked me. I knew the scars of the past would never fully fade. The whispers might return with the next fog, the shade's hunger reawakening with every soul lost to regret. But for now there was peace, a fragile, trembling peace that offered a chance to heal, to forgive, and perhaps to live. The island, cloaked in fog and memory, breathed deeply once more. And as I turned away from the graveyard that had claimed so much of my life, I carried with me the weight of sorrow and the light of hard-won acceptance. The dead were quiet, the earth still, but the story was far from over. The shadows watched, always watching, and I would be ready. The graveyard that once breathed in whispers now slept beneath the mist. But in that sleep, the promise of dawn held the fragile hope that even in the darkest places, peace could be found if only for a moment.